Then we get back into these NFC teams that have a lot of question marks. It'll just be really interesting to hear your thoughts on how we should look at these teams. And the first one, we're going to start out with the NFC East and look at the New York Giants. The number one thing that we see there is a new coaching staff.
Yeah, I mean, they're interesting. We talked about the Eagles being another interesting one. We've talked about them a lot. So if you haven't been listening a ton, certainly, I mean, they're an interesting squad as well. But the Giants, to me, seem fairly straightforward early on in drafts as I think a stack that you want to be getting some exposure to in best ball because it's pretty cheap. It's sort of an easy way if you get kind of a premium stack to get another stack. You have Daniel Jones at quarterback with the mobility, has not been very good so far in his career. You have Kenny Gallade, who was going significantly higher last year than he is, like just ridiculously higher last year than he is this year. And he had a terrible season last year, but he's still not old, right? And he was a little banged up last year. There's still plenty of good football probably left in him than we saw earlier in his career in Detroit, where that's an easy way to stack this up. You have Kadarius Toney as a really interesting small sample rookie player who drew targets at an incredibly high rate, very wide range of what could happen with him. We don't know a lot about the off-field stuff or how, whether he's going to continue to sort of have some issues that might keep him from playing full slates of games with, again, a new coaching staff. Maybe he won't, right? You have Wandel Robinson, a prospect we really like that comes in. So you have this whole group of very interesting players. Obviously, Saquon, very interesting running back who's been hurt the last few years. And they're cheap. I mean, Saquon's obviously expensive, but I think Daniel Jones and the receivers are all very affordable in drafts in a way that, to me, that's sort of the straightforward way that I've been thinking about it is like, what if Brian Daboll was a big reason why the Bills have been so good? What if he brings a lot of that analytically focused, early down pass rate and pass first mentality to New York, even if they're not particularly efficient, just calling plays in a way that does help their offense sort of overperform what they are in terms of talent. It could be a fairly interesting offense. What do you see? That to me is sort of the straightforward question, right? But what do you see as sort of some of the nuance here? Because I think a lot of people are concerned about Toney and Wan'Dale kind of coexisting, sort of similar profiles, shallower A dots, maybe playing similar roles within a formation. I think there's definitely concern about Golladay. I mean, judging by his ADP, but I think he's a fairly easy value pick. I don't want to have a ton of him, but I want to have some. What do you see as sort of more of the nuance with this offense?
Yeah, so you mentioned this coaching staff and the analytically focused mindset. They're going to be pass first, you would think. But then the tricky part is, well, how does that work with Daniel Jones? Now, the funny thing is you actually go in and you look at our NFL pace tool, you pull up 2021, look at week 1 through 18, and you can slide the point differential to any category that you desire. You put it to 0 to 7. So a team that's tied to leading by a touchdown. Buffalo was number 2 in the NFL in terms of pass rate, but the Giants actually weren't that far behind. The problem just is that when you look at the number of plays in that category and the number of pass plays per 60 minutes, when we're looking at it from that perspective, still Buffalo a lot more. The question that the Giants coaching staff will have to answer is, can Daniel Jones hold up to that type of offense? And where is Saquon Barkley in this mix? Now, one of the things that we've heard in the early offseason is they've been using Barkley all over the formation. This is kind of one of those things that is very similar to the best shape of his life type of narrative, but it's something that still you would prefer to hear as opposed to the other direction, right? A lot of the passes that we may see from this team in all different types of game script could be passes to Barkley where they're trying not to simply run him into the line. One of the frustrating things last year was that and partly as someone who had Barkley on some squads, when you're watching this Giants team that can't move the ball and then they hand it to him and he's tackled in the backfield, you're left with this question of, well, I can't even evaluate where he is when I'm watching that play. But then the other thing is just that's such a low value touch when we know that Barkley coming off of those injuries is going to probably be touch limited. To have that kind of touch in the mix is very, very frustrating Fast forward a year, I think that he's going to be healthier. I think that the touches are going to be much more high value. And we've been trying not to push it too much because we've been also trying to load up on Barkley in this early third round range. That ADP has disappeared. He's now moving into the mid second. It gets trickier there because the players you have to pass on and the build that you have is different if you're taking him in the mid second. Probably still a value though. But you mentioned these 4 wide receivers, and we pull up your stealing signals tool modeled after what you do. Again, you're not responsible for this tool. So anybody who has any questions about what you see, message Dave Cabin at rotovizmain@gmail.com. But you look at this and the way that these guys played last year, you mentioned Kenny Gallade. The frustrating thing for him is that he just did not draw targets on a per route basis hardly at all, right? Down there below 20%. And that's below guys like Kyle Rudolph and Devontae Booker. You look up there at the top when you have Kadarius Toney, you mentioned him. One of the things that's interesting there is that even when he played outside of a couple of games, his route percentages were not as high as you might think. Now, we know that he was playing injured in a couple of situations. And also
he got ejected in a game.
Right. So he ends up having this very narrow window where he's actually playing. And so we have to take that into context as well. But not only was Gallaudet not drawing targets, but he was very inefficient on a per target basis, below 7 yards per target there. Sterling Shepard also down in that range. Now, when I'm looking at the weekly stat tool and we're looking at these wide receivers, the thing that jumps out is that Sterling Shepard in the games that he played was still the leader in target share, but even in that perspective, he just played the 7 games, but he's down at 21%. Golladay below that, obviously Slayton not having many routes below that, Toney below that. And with Shepard, the interesting thing is that he might mix in a little bit here, but he has this ADP that's toward the end of drafts, and that part almost seems unrealistic as well, even though he appears to be going through practices and whatnot for the Giants. But you have this Achilles injury at the end of last season. We know that those are difficult to come back from. He's had all of these hamstring injuries. He's had multiple concussion problems. Sterling Shepard, unfortunately, is just someone who's very unlikely to stay healthy. From a drafter perspective, if you like his talent, and there have been windows where Shepard has flashed pretty serious talent, but you're probably not going to be able to count on him playing much. Then in some ways that actually frees up these other guys. And then you mentioned we really like Wandel Robinson. The tricky part here is how will Wandale be used? How much overlap is there with Toney? And then if we have these 4 wide receivers, plus perhaps Slayton, plus perhaps, other more peripheral players working in, do any of these guys get up to the target volume they would need to really be targets in a best ball draft, in a redraft draft, even if we like the talent and even if we see some contingency based upside, and even if the price is not prohibitive?
Yeah. And I think that's a question of philosophy somewhat in what you're targeting, because I think it's pretty easy to say with the expected pass rate that it's very likely that one of these guys or a couple of these guys is going to be better than their ADP in that traditional sense of saying, is their finish at the position higher than where they were drafted and thus a value. Because I mean, really the only outcome where that doesn't happen is the efficiency is really poor and it's really spread, because we're talking about really cheap prices basically across the board. So if it's very spread out and the efficiency is poor, even a high pass rate won't, may not be enough. But if the efficiency is even close to average, if it's at all concentrated, you said, the contingency based upside, if there's injuries, if Golladay misses time, what does that mean for Toney or whoever potentially stepping into a pretty clear number 1 role for a stretch? Or if Toney is missing time, is Golladay a pretty clear number 1 for a stretch? That type of concentration would pretty clearly make them a value. But when I say it's a philosophical question, I think, as you were kind of talking through that, is the juice worth the squeeze? I mean, yes, they can beat ADP, but when you were saying, is there enough targets for them to be a target for us in drafts? I know your barometer is higher, my barometer is higher. We want wide receivers that are going to be difference makers. And so it's a question of who here actually has the potential to be good enough for long enough And there is a potential that the offense as a whole is efficient or is average efficiency. Again, that Dable comes in and actually makes a big difference in terms of the play calling and the usage and a lot of different things that can happen with a coaching change. This is an offense that could be markedly different. Although that requires quite a big difference in the play of Daniel Jones, who has not been very good. I mean, that's just a simple fact. But I think of the players that are there, I mean, Shepard's a guy that I was interested in early in the offseason until kind of remembering the Achilles stuff. I just have a really hard time seeing it for him. Wandel has the potential to especially be a sort of a late season hammer if he comes on. I mean, if you want to look for this year's Amon-Ra St. Brown, I mean, I think that's very possible for him. It's, there's just questions of his size, and people are comparing him to Rondale Moore. Well, we think Rondale Moore probably still has potential to be a lot better than what we saw last year. I'm comfortable with him. I'm comfortable with Toney in the right spots. I do think the upside is there from what he flashed in his small sample last year, but there's a lot of risk. I mean, it comes with a wide range. It's not necessarily a small miss, big hit type play. To me, it's a big miss, big hit. And I think I'm comfortable with Gallade. I mean, I think I can see for Wan'Dale and Toney and Gallaudet scenarios where they can be good enough that it really does crush their ADP and justifies a lot of this, but it does require kind of a two-step. It requires the offense being better, and then it requires them to be the guy. Again, I think there's a lot of scenarios where we can say that one of these guys will be a little bit better than ADP, but if the offense is still not efficient, maybe none of them will really crush ADP.
I think it's a perfect way to look at it. One of the things that appeals to me a lot in drafts right now is that, especially in the hyper fragile builds, if you're looking for receivers to pepper in all through the draft and late in drafts, these guys give you options that could be, as you mentioned, big hits. I like Wan'Dale very, very late. His price extremely appealing. I think that you want to put him into as many teams as you can kind of make fit. He's got that week 9 bye, which sometimes is a little bit tricky. It's the heaviest bye week. And if you already have a lot of receivers with that week 9 bye, then maybe he doesn't work at the end. KJ Hamler in a similar circumstance there. But Toney and Gallade, because I like them but don't need to have them, those are both players where you got two different shots at it, and you can always look to get them after ADP, because if you miss, I mean, it's probably not a big deal to what you're trying to do. And then with Gallaudet, especially, you said, some of these things are going to, we'll see how the offense evolves. One of the elements that they've talked about is that they're going to try and get Daniel Jones to push the ball a little bit more, push it in intelligent situations. When you look at what he did last year with the 10 touchdowns and the 7 interceptions, obviously that's not a good ratio there. But Gallaudet needs him to be able to throw down the field to unlock what Gallaudet does best. We talk about Gallaudet and just how terrible his profile was last year. But obviously the reason they signed him to that big contract is that he did add that vertical element for the Lions. Gallaudet to hit, he has to be healthy, and then he needs this coaching staff to make a big difference in terms of the way that he's utilized, not just in terms of himself, but how they unlock Daniel Jones. If that happens, Gallaudet could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, he's interesting because both the 2 years before he left Detroit, his yards per out run were over 2. The final year, 2020, a smaller route sample, but a full year in 2019. A lot of that was driven by the yards per target side. He didn't draw targets at a huge clip. And you mentioned it was even down last year from that, but he has never really shown a huge targets per out run ceiling. But because he adds the vertical element, the really high ADOT, if Jones is good at throwing the ball down the field, I mean, I've looked at it in terms of the weighted targets per out run and included air yards. He gets to pretty comfortable ranges there. And then while he was with Detroit, he had multiple seasons in a row of a strong yards per target, strong efficiency. He's actually a very good downfield receiver when you have the high ADOT and you're earning at least some volume, solid volume. If you're able to make enough plays in these jump ball, contested catch situations, if you will, you're going to have a pretty strong yards per target. There's going to be a little bit of correlation between that ADOT and the yards per target. And so he was able to maintain that very effectively throughout his Detroit career. It cratered last year, that efficiency, the downfield efficiency. And that's a big reason we see him be so poor last year, as well as, not earning as much targets as we said, or maybe sometimes it's just Daniel Jones not feeling comfortable pulling the trigger down the field as much, or going quick to Toney in some of those spots in the games where Toney was there. But yeah, the pro outcome or the positive, bull case for Kenny Golladay is, look, he earns more targets, and what we saw over multiple years in Detroit, which was better than last year, we get back there. and we see the improved efficiency downfield, I don't think it's crazy. I mean, I definitely think there's still scenarios. I think the Giants are, it's a new regime, but they are tied to him somewhat with, a pretty solid contract. They got to be thinking we want to make him into a key part of our passing game. I mean, that would be, if I'm Brian Dable and I'm coming in, it's like I got to find a way to get Kenny Golladay going. That's going to open up a lot if we can get him as a vertical element. And they had success in Buffalo for a long time, obviously, with different vertical receivers. Even if he's, a Gabriel Davis with more routes, like that's not Stephon Diggs necessarily, not the number one in that we've known from Buffalo, but this vertical player and red zone threat that Gabe Davis was last year. Obviously, Gallaudet would be running more routes. I mean, that would be a pretty solid outcome for Gallaudet, but a lot of that does hinge, as you said, on Daniel Jones' ability to get the ball to him down the field, and that efficiency side, I think, is going to be really, really huge. A reasonable bet to make, though.